You're looking at a road that shouldn't exist. It stretches 20,000 kilometers, crosses 15 countries, and cost the UN over $50 billion. On paper, it is a straight shot from the coast of Portugal to the neon streets of Tokyo, the longest drivable path in history. But you can't drive it. Not because of traffic, but because of 5 glitches. 5 physical gaps so strange and dangerous, they have effectively cut the world in half. This isn't just a story about a road. It's a warning about the world we actually live in. In 1959, the United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East set down a vision, a continuous road, crossing borders and time zones, linking the farthest corners of Asia to the heart of Europe. This was not just a dream scribbled in the margins of a conference agenda. The call for an interregional highway became the backbone of decades of planning, negotiation, and legal drafting. By 2003, that vision had hardened into international law. 32 countries signed the Asian Highway Agreement, binding themselves to build, maintain, and open their segments of a 140,000-kilometer network. At its core, Asian Highway 1, a single corridor stretching 20,557 kilometers from Tokyo to Istanbul, with a legal spine running through every customs clause, maintenance schedule, and cross-border dispute mechanism. The treaty is explicit. Article after article spells out mutual recognition of road licenses, joint responsibility for upgrades, and a framework for settling disagreements in international court. The expectation was clear. With this level of legal and diplomatic commitment, the road should work. The signatures on the agreement include rivals, adversaries, and uneasy neighbors, all pledging to keep the corridor open. The UN ESCAP Secretariat, based in Bangkok, became the custodian of this promise, tracking compliance, coordinating upgrades, and reporting annually on progress to the General Assembly. Every signatory agreed to standardized signage, minimum construction standards, and harmonized customs procedures, on paper, a guarantee that a truck could roll from one end to the other without hitting a bureaucratic wall. Yet despite this legal foundation, the reality on the ground tells a different story. The ink on the treaties is dry, the rules are in place, the road exists in law and in fact. But the promise of a seamless drive remains just out of reach, raising a question that echoes through every border post and customs plaza. How can a project so vast, so meticulously planned, still be undrivable? Official maps of Asian Highway 1 trace a continuous red line across the continent, a promise of unbroken tarmac from Tokyo to Istanbul. But on the ground, that line often vanishes into gravel, dead ends, or outright impassable borders. The road exists in government documents, in annual reports, and in glossy presentations to international donors. Yet the experience of trying to drive it exposes a stark disconnect. The corridor is undrivable end to end, no matter what the paperwork claims. Billions have been allocated, and the Asian Development Bank's financial ledgers show new budget lines opened every fiscal year. The 2022 ADB report lists $3.4 billion dispersed for regional connectivity, with another $12 billion approved for ongoing Asian highway projects. But nearly half of these funds remain idle, sitting in escrow accounts or caught in bureaucratic limbo. The money is real. The road, in many places, is not. Satellite images and field surveys tell a story that the official numbers avoid. Segments declared complete still show stretches of unpaved earth, washed-out bridges, and customs posts barricaded against through traffic. In Myanmar, border crossings that appear open on ministry websites are blocked by militia checkpoints. In Vietnam, typhoon damage has erased entire sections, while the official status remains operational. In the Korea Strait, the legal route is a tunnel that doesn't exist, while ferries do the work of a promised bridge. Contradiction is not hidden in fine print. It is visible in every policy memo that proclaims substantial completion, while quietly noting that 45% of allocated funds have not reached contractors or local agencies. This is not a story of an abandoned project, but of a corridor that remains alive on balance sheets and in diplomatic communiques, yet broken on the ground. The gap between the paper road and the asphalt one is not an accident, it is the defining fact of Asian Highway 1. The numbers behind Asian Highway 1 are staggering, but the picture they paint is anything but clear. The $50 billion figure, so often repeated in headlines and donor speeches, floats through annual reports and glossy brochures, but never lands in a single, unverifiable ledger. Dig into the Asian Development Bank's own tables, and the story shifts. Only about $12 billion in funding can be tracked to actual contracts, tenders, and on-the-ground work. The rest, nearly 45% of all approved funds, sits untouched, locked in escrow, or trapped in bureaucratic review cycles that seem to stretch on indefinitely. This is not a case of missing money or vanished budgets. The cash exists, accounted for in balance sheets and multi-year plans, but it is not moving. In some years, disbursement rates for key segments have dipped below 55%, leaving entire tranches idle while construction deadlines slip by. The Asian Development Bank, the corridor's chief financier, publishes annual updates filled with optimistic projections and completion percentages, but their own financial statements quietly admit the gap: billions approved, billions unspent, and a corridor that remains, in critical places, a promise rather than a passage. So where does the $50 billion claim come from? Not from any public audit or donor spreadsheet. It is a media myth, an aggregate of pledges, projections, and wishful accounting that has been recycled for years without hard evidence. The only numbers that stand up to scrutiny are the $12 billion in tracked expenditures and the stubborn reality that nearly half of all funds remain undelivered. Money alone is not the missing link. The real barrier is not financial, but political, a system where funds can be allocated, yet the road itself remains broken. The paradox is stark. The world's longest planned highway is not starved of cash or abandoned by its backers. Instead, it is a corridor where money piles up while the asphalt runs out. The next step is not a question of budgets, but of borders, decisions, and the will to connect what paper and treaties have already promised. Barbed wire and painted gates slice through the Punjab plain, dividing what was once a single bustling artery into two worlds. The Wagah border, drawn by the Radcliffe Award in 1947, became the most iconic checkpoint on the Asian Highway 1 corridor, a line meant to connect, now hardened into a symbol of separation. The road here is flawless: 4 lanes, floodlit plazas, customs towers capable of processing 2,000 trucks a day. But the traffic never comes. Official customs records from 2024 show the reality. Indian authorities cleared just 9,800 trucks at Atari, a sharp drop from the previous year. Pakistani side logged 10,200, with a third of those classified as re-exports, never venturing beyond the border zone. The design capacity is a fantasy. What's actually permitted is a trickle, choked by policy. In the spring, a new Indian Customs Circular, CBI-CBIC 2024-07, classified Wagah as a strategic border, no commercial transit. Every truck without a strategic goods clearance certificate is turned away. On the other side, Pakistan Rangers enforced Directive 2024-03, requiring a special bilateral permit for each vehicle, usually reserved for humanitarian supplies. Bulk cargo, steel, cement, even grain, sits idle or is rerouted hundreds of kilometers off course. Numbers reveal the blockade's scale. Month after month, the combined clearance rate for both sides never rises above 800 trucks, barely 10% of what the infrastructure could handle. In August, only 350 Indian trucks and 360 Pakistani trucks crossed. In total, at least 350 trucks were denied entry over the year, not for lack of paperwork, but because their destination lay beyond the Punjab to Sindh corridor. Security directives, not road quality, dictate the flow. The border is fully functional in concrete and steel, yet paralyzed by politics. This is not an engineering failure. The road is open. The will to use it is not. Decades of unresolved conflict, 4 wars, nuclear standoffs, the ongoing Kashmir dispute have fused the line at Wagah into a permanent checkpoint. No new treaty has replaced the original 1947 boundary. Only memoranda and operational handbooks reiterate the same restrictions, year after year. The daily spectacle of synchronized border guards cannot mask the underlying reality. The Asian Highway 1, built for connection, is stopped cold by history. The promise of seamless transit dies here, not for lack of asphalt, but because the past refuses to let go. Highway 1 cuts a 2,400-kilometer arc through Afghanistan, linking Iran's border to the edge of Central Asia. On the map, it is a vital artery, one that should, in theory, carry freight and travelers from Istanbul to Shanghai. In reality, it is a corridor defined by danger, not connection. The Asian Development Bank's own risk assessments place this stretch in the highest possible category for security threats. Every kilometer is shadowed by the legacy of war, shifting alliances, and a government that rules by decree. Since the collapse of the previous Afghan government in August 2021, the Taliban have enforced a strict permit system for any long-distance movement on the highway. Foreign vehicles are required to obtain written clearance from the Taliban's Ministry of Transport, a process that is rarely granted and often subject to sudden cancellation. Local drivers face roadside checks by armed patrols, with permits scrutinized at makeshift barriers. The rule is simple: no permit, no passage. The Afghan Highway Authority, now operating under Taliban oversight, has no control over these restrictions. Their engineers maintain the roadbed where they can, but the decision to open or close the route rests with security commanders, not civil planners. The scale of violence is not an abstraction. The Asian Development Bank's 2023 risk report lists 312 separate attacks on Highway 1 that year alone. These range from roadside bombings and ambushes to kidnappings and targeted assassinations. Convoys traveling between Kandahar and Herat navigate a landscape where burned-out trucks and cratered tarmac are more common than functioning rest stops. Insurance is impossible to obtain. Aid agencies keep their convoys small, unmarked, and timed to avoid dusk or dawn, when attacks are most likely. For international transporters, the message is clear. No amount of engineering can overcome a road that is, by decree and by force, closed to the outside world. The route exists, but it is not a road in any practical sense. It is a boundary, a line that both defines and divides, patrolled by men with rifles rather than customs officers with stamps. The promise of Asian Highway 1 in Afghanistan is held hostage by the reality of war. 12 villages once stood along the planned route of Asian Highway 1 in eastern Myanmar. In the official records, these communities disappear with a single line: right-of-way cleared. On the ground, the destruction is total. Bulldozers arrived at dawn, escorted by Ministry of Construction officials and local police. By the end of the week, only foundations and broken walls remained. Satellite data from the 2024 Roads Without Borders survey confirms the loss. 78 kilometers of the original AH1 alignment wiped from the map, replaced by empty fields and hastily erected fences. Displacement registers compiled by NGOs count more than 2,000 people forced out, none receiving formal compensation. The rationale, delivered in a terse ministry statement, cited strategic necessity and regional connectivity, but the promised road never materialized. Instead, the corridor was rerouted, adding nearly 200 kilometers to the cross-border journey and shifting the burden onto already strained local roads. Truckers now detour through the Dawe-Mongla corridor, burning extra fuel and days in transit. The Asian Development Bank's own ledgers show that only 55% of the segment's $6.5 billion budget has reached contractors. The rest sits in escrow as land disputes and legal challenges grind on. Official maps still trace a straight line from Myawaddy to the Thai border, but the real road veers wide, skirting the scars of forced removal. In a region untouched by open war, the highway is interrupted not by violence, but by the deliberate hand of the state. Proof that even in peacetime, a road can be broken by decree. 45 kilometers of Asian Highway 1 between Bangladesh and India remain a rutted stretch of gravel, exposed to every monsoon and bureaucratic whim. On satellite images, it stands out as a scar, gray, uneven, and seasonally erased by floodwater. The official line calls this segment complete, but the reality is a yearly shutdown that brings traffic to a halt for weeks on end. Trucks line up at Mohanpur, engines idling for days, as customs officers shuffle paperwork that never seems to move. The logs from Petropol show waits of up to 36 hours, even in the dry season. During the rains, the crossing closes altogether, the gravel dissolving into mud, and the promises of all-weather passage lost once again. A Bangladesh customs officer, pressed for explanation, gestures at the rows of trucks and the battered roadbed. "Funds are allocated," he says, "but we have no authority to spend." The Asian Development Bank's own disbursement tables confirm it. 29% of the budget for this stretch sits idle, locked in accounts that no one can touch without signatures from ministries in Dhaka and New Delhi. The money is there, the need is obvious, but the gravel remains. This is not a remote mountain pass or a war zone. It is a flat, fertile borderland where the only real obstacle is the tangle of forms, approvals, and cross-border suspicion. The gap endures not for lack of resources, but because no one is willing to claim responsibility for closing it. The Asian Highway's grand vision is reduced here to a seasonal track, a corridor that works only on paper and in the dry months. The road exists, but the will to finish it does not. A single satellite pass on October 21, 2024, captured what no press release could deny. The Sentinel-2 image, sharp at 10 meters, shows a fresh scar slicing through the northern edge of Kaesong. Where Asian Highway 1 once threaded its way toward the Chinese border, there is now only bare earth and the geometric pattern of demolition. 12 kilometers of highway reduced to rubble in less than a week. Earth-moving equipment stands idle beside the cratered right-of-way, the roadbed erased to the subsoil. For years, this corridor was more than an abstraction. The Kaesong Industrial Complex, once the centerpiece of cross-border commerce, pumped out $3.1 billion in annual output and supported 150,000 workers on both sides of the divide. Now, the highway's role as a lifeline is visible only in the negative space of what's been destroyed. North Korea's official statement, issued the day after the satellite evidence went public, called the demolition routine maintenance and dismissed reports of sabotage as malicious fabrication. Yet the facts are irrefutable. The corridor is gone, the exclusion zone patrolled, and the border sealed tighter than at any point since the armistice. No engineering challenge caused this break. It is the result of a deliberate act, a decision to cut the continent's main artery, leaving the world's longest planned highway severed by policy, not by terrain. The last obstacle is not a mountain or a war zone, but the Korea Strait, a stretch of water just under 100 kilometers wide, separating Japan's Kyushu from the port of Busan. Here, the official route of Asian Highway 1 simply runs out, replaced by ferry timetables and seasonal weather reports. 3 main ferries now carry the load: the Busan-Fukuoka catamaran, a 3-hour crossing with space for 150 vehicles; the overnight Busan-Shimonoseki line, handling up to 800 vehicles at a time; and a freight route to Mokpo, used mostly by trucks. Combined, these services move more than 2 million vehicle kilometers each year, with reliability above 95%, except when winter storms or political disputes intervene. In December 2025, a Korean passenger ferry ran aground, halting service for days and prompting another round of safety reviews. Yet for all their efficiency, ferries are a workaround, not a solution. The tunnel that would close the gap, a 130-kilometer undersea link, has been studied, costed, and shelved again and again. The 2018 technical report set the price at $100 billion, with a projected timeline of at least 12 years. But in a 2025 poll, 68% of South Koreans opposed any joint mega-project with Japan, citing history and distrust. Japanese ministries remain cautious, wary of cost overruns and diplomatic fallout. The 2024 export control dispute only deepened the divide. For now, ministries on both sides prefer to subsidize ferries and postpone the tunnel's fate. The legal route exists only on paper, interrupted by water and by memory. Here, at the edge of the continent, the world's longest planned road ends not in triumph, but in a standoff, proof that even the simplest gap can be impossible to bridge when politics, history, and national pride outweigh the promise of connection. A $50 billion promise written in concrete and ambition is still broken by 5 political lines. These aren't engineering failures, they're fractures left by war, rivalry, and unresolved history. Today, the world's longest road remains interrupted by human choice, not physical terrain. Until those choices change, every gap is a mirror, reflecting the true borders that divide us. What would it take to finally close them?